Just last week, one of my colleagues, Dr. Turner, who has a board outside her office, asked students to write 2 things they're most afraid of. Of the 7 posts on the first day, 5 of them had as a primary fear being forgotten, being irrelevant, or their contributions being of little worth. I was a little surprised because these were music students. And you all know a lot of musicians who pack stadiums, who are used by politicians to prep them, who are used by pastors to prep them. So it was kind of amazing that musicians who are actually most of the people who are the most famous in the world would be afraid that they would be forgotten, that they would be irrelevant, or their contribution would be of little worth. So I was thinking about this as I was trying to figure out what's the best way to start this talk, but this thought kept coming in my mind, and I'm of Pentecostal background, and I just believe in the prompting of the Holy Spirit, like in the moment or in preparation before you get there. And if there's anyone here who thinks that they have little worth or little relevance, God does not make mistakes. You are not a mistake. I will provide a close reading of one work by one artist to demonstrate the intentional and unconscious formation of an artwork that speaks beyond the moment of the creator in big and small ways. So this presentation is really about the agency of individuals and the agency of a single work. In 2016, Reuben Kigame, that you see in the picture over there, and that is the cover of the album that I'm going to talk about. He's a renowned and decorated Kenyan Christian musician, producer, and apologist. He released an album called Usifadhaike. Usifadhaike has new songs and reissues of previous releases of Kigame's work and those of other artists that he works with. The album also contains songs sourced from Kigame's earliest incursions into the gospel music ministry and industry, while affiliated with Word of Life Ministry, housed in Nairobi and Mombasa, Kenya's biggest and busiest cities. I just wanted you to all be sure that you know where Kenya is, and so that's that slide over there. And the busiest cities, one of them is Mombasa, and that's Nairobi, and that's where Word of Life had offices that Kigame worked with. The 2 Kiswahili songs on the album are called Kile Unachopanda and Simbanguruma. They immediately became very popular in Christian gatherings sponsored by organizations such as Youth for Christ that targeted high school students and college students. They were also staples in young adult church meetings and in Christian youth conventions in the 1980s, before the gospel music industry that I've studied a little bit extensively, before this industry gelled, and before compositions by African Christian musicians and in African languages were acknowledged as worthy of being recorded or copyrighted for posterity or economic returns. Kigame is well reputed as a national and international composer and performer, but he's also a worship leader. Apart from theological topics and other biblical stuff that he does, Kigame addresses issues and anxieties of the time in appropriate musical styles and scriptures across generational, denominational, and social barriers. His compositions present the gospel, but he also adjudicates discussions on contentious and unstable opinions. For example, worship wars in Kenya engage genres traditionally marginalized or peripheralized in Christian communities, such as indigenous African Christian music repertory, previously demonized by mainstream churches before, during, and after colonialization. Kigame legitimizes musics from these spirit churches by repackaging them using modern instruments or by simulating indigenous musical aesthetics in the studio, or by actually using indigenous instruments. Thus, he resounds their return and disseminates them through contemporary media. He also reworks Western hymns that are part of the collective Christian law in the country. And besides hymns, Kigame translates popular and contemporary worship songs into Kiswahili. Some of Kigame's recordings, however, are a conscious response as an apologist on the use of styles associated with secular music in Christian assemblies. While this debate is not unique to Africa, Kigame offers written responses in blogs and interviews, but by far his larger audience comes from the singing that he does. Kigame also seeks to allay fears about using styles and instruments related to other religious beliefs, as these are coded and subtle indices of asyncretic Christianity that is heatedly contested in the conservative climate of fundamental or Pentecostal or charismatic Christianity that crystallized in the late 1980s Africa. It is this nexus of religious anxiety that I would like to explore by reading Kigame's production and performance of Simbanguruma, one of the songs on the album. This piece, in my opinion, represents a dimension of past and ongoing discussions that enact, affirm, critique, and problematize, returning, retuning, resounding, and a reassembling of disparate resources to service and postulate Christian belief, Christian theology, and Christian doctrine, as well as the accompanying lived experiences, co-expectations, and future hopes of Africans through religious popular music expressions. They usually expect economic returns from them. Simbanguruma, these are the various ways you can translate it from the Kiswahili. It is set in a continentally pervasive, a popular style that's called sukus. Sukus is generically understood as an African rumba form that codified in the Congos in the 1950s. Just so you can see where Congo is in relation to Kenya. There is Kenya over there, and these are the Congos. There's Congo Democratic and Congo Republic, those two Congos. But these styles were felt all over East and Central Africa and beyond, including Nigeria, for various reasons that I'm going to talk about. So they were equally reinvented by the Congolese diaspora and exile in other African countries when these two countries experienced political turmoil. These diasporic movements sometimes resulted from dialogues with music styles from host countries or were born in projects where Congolese were studio musicians. Congolese rumba itself was a remake of Cuban son, rumba, montuno. Genres that had African foundations or overtones. It was therefore a return to the mother continent that was returned in language, structure, form, then retuned, reimagined, and resounded and in clubs, in recordings, and on radio. The mostly Cuban bass was thus recreated in Congolese urban and industrial environments, themselves places of exile and displacement. Congolese cities and mining towns where these genres emerged housed multiple African groups and also interacted with European colonizers and adventure seekers. Traditional Congolese beliefs and values were forced to cohabit and dialogue with these various cultures that met over there. In the Katanga province of the Democratic Republic of Congo, a rich mining region, the lingua franca was Kiswahili, rather than Lingala that was spoken in most parts of the Congos. The presence of Kiswahili was a strong indicator that Islam was among the various religions practiced among the miners. The most enduring frame of Congolese sukus was a two-part structure equivalent to the Cuban son, rumba, montuno structure. The son rumba part was usually slower in tempo, where a story was narrated by a soloist or in duet. The second part was in call and response, where the main message was reinforced using a signature riff or phrase and reiterated by a responding chorus against an extemporizing soloist. The Cuban two-part form in Congolese return was translated as rumba Seben. This was in the 20th century cities where it gelled, or in the mining regions where these workers congregated. This was the main leisure activity of these people. After telling the story in the rumba section, the Seben was announced by a definite break. During the rumba section, there was always dancing. Couples would hold each other, but as soon as the Seben was announced, they invariably broke apart and displayed their best contemporary dance moves. The singing ceased during a subsection of the Seben so that singers on stage could dance or demonstrate to the revelers how to respond bodily, or else they provoked the dancers to display their internalization of the music in their bodies. The dancers and even the instrumentalists behaved as if they were possessed by the spirit of the music. When Congolese exile ruled the club scene and airwaves in Kenya from the late 1960s to the early 1980s, Kenyans referred to this section where there was no singing or nothing else but the dancing to a climax. To mark the end of the climax, the lead singer recalled the message, and the choral response often included revelers who brought themselves from the dance high through singing. Of course, if the music was too sweet to stop, a subsequent climax was effected in a way similar to Pentecostal spontaneous singing, to shouts, or to praise breaks in an African-American gathering. And today, in many African assemblies that use this kind of style, people actually say we are having a Seben section. Simbanguruma was composed in the 1980s by a guy called Kamondo wa Luvembe. He was a former colleague of Kigame's from his Word of Life days. In Suku-style settings, instruments index the genre. There are hand drums, drum set, guitar combo, and the guitar was like a solo guitar, and then another guitar part called a mi solo, which was kind of like not the soloist, but kind of half solo. And then there was a rhythm guitar, and then there was a bass guitar, and then there were brass instruments, and clarinet was a very common instrument in the early days. It was replaced later by a saxophone. And then there was other percussion, and of course, from the 1970s, you start to have synthesizers. And the structure was like in two parts in Rumba Seben form with the climax. In Kigame's iteration of this form, he doesn't set the first part in rumba form. Instead, he invokes Tarab Chakacha style, which is signals through the opening percussion riff. Tarab in itself is most associated with African and West Asian, Indian Ocean coastline lands and islands, but it extends inland through the Red Sea to Egypt, Morocco, and Tunisia as a particular and dominant Arabic cultural aesthetic. It's therefore read as linked to Islam or Islamized population in Eastern Africa. Chakacha is a song dance style that also has its roots among coastal Kenyan ethnic groups called Mijikenda. It was prominently performed at weddings or other related rites in both indigenous and Islamized ritual spaces. If you came to the concert last night, when the lady was dancing, there was a certain body movement that she had at the waist that is very similar to Chakacha dancing. I'm not going to demonstrate it. Why? Because you are here. Usually those things are usually done in private. Sorry. I just put the words over there so that when I play it, you'll be able to follow along. Kigame begins the song as if he's dancing, and you'll hear him sounding as if he has a satisfied grunt as soon as the music begins. A translation of his opening spoken word, as you can see up there, is the praises of the Lion of Judah should begin from the coastlands and extend into all the earth. And then you have a lyrical chant by the chorus which is the title thing that recognizes the person as the roar of the lion. After this, Kigame pronounces the story. So let's listen to a little bit of it from the beginning. So starting with the drums is very African. You hear the roar? There he is grunting.
Nguruma. Simbanguruma. Simbanguruma. Simbanguruma.
Hear the bass running. And he starts saying, I'll play a little bit more later. So this is what happens with the piece on this next slide. He starts telling the story, and then the choir comments on it, and then he tells the story some more, and then the choir comments on it, and then he tells the story again, and the choir comments on it. This is typical Chakacha and Rumba style. So let me just play, and please follow with the words because I know you can now all read Kiswahili. Then you hear the mariachi. These lyrics gesture to coastal people's beliefs in spirit. Most stories of genies, which we call in Kiswahili majini, which also means off or in the water, are rife in their folklore, whether in intersection with West and South Asians over time or as part of indigenous cultural beliefs. Kigame brings this awareness to the table. His opening lyric situates the Lion of Judah as invading the depths of hell or the underworld with his roar. The sound is such that Satan and the demons tremble with fear. He further states that this lion has trounced Satan and the demons with an eternal damnation. He has given them a lashing that they will never recover from. Kigame's solo is developed in typical modern Tarab form. His opening phrase sets the stage, while the choral response describes the impact of the roar of the lion on devils and demons. Notwithstanding their fright, the Lion of Judah executes judgment. The singer tells the story as an observer of what he has seen or is seeing, or what he has heard or is hearing. This is typical in Sang Chakacha, Tarab, and Rumba. To further index coastal or Islamic ethos, Kigame recounts this statement by employing Indic and Arabic voicing and tone color. I'll just play a little bit of the beginning so you can hear how he does it with melismas. He just indexes. That is not typical singing of him. That is typical singing from the coastal side of Kenya and also from learning from Indians. He also incorporates instrumentation borrowed from Indian Hindu practice, the harmonium. If you had the interlude in between, it was he simulates it actually on an accordion, but he's imitating the harmonium, together with bow strings that were originally part of an orchestra called a taht that was part of Tarab singing that was adopted from Egyptian ensembles. The instrumental response can also be read as an extension of embellishment ideal, an Indic idea of flowering the rhetoric. Other Indic markers include occasional slides on the drum that reference the sliding technique on a tabla, but also index a lion's roar. Beyond these coastal signifiers, the opening and punctuating riff echoes the use of brass instruments in Congolese sukus, sourced from European military and Christian religious or educational parades. But you could hear also the mariachi kind of sound that tells you that he's very aware of the growing importance of mariachi on the continent. In response and agreement with the soloist, the choir sings in harmony, in parallel thirds or sixths, typical in rumba, but adopted in Tarab during the convergence of rumba as a traveling popular music that serviced the tourist industry in coastal Kenya and was performed by musicians who also played Tarab. It's also built on a 3/2 clave, but it's a very different feeling from the rumba. It's a typical Tarab 3/2 clave. Just so you can hear the Seben section, so you can hear the contrast. Usually there's a cadential break and exuberant celebration with vocals that are designed to demonstrate the source of authority of the roaring lion. It is established not by the typical solo guitar that is typical in rumba, but with a string sound to take the edge off the expectation to respond with suggestive dancing associated with secular clubbing. If you listen to the piece along with the text, you will also experience how the soloist guides, encourages, comments on who the Lion of Judah is, how the crowd affirms and celebrates this Lion of Judah and his mission. And this is part of what happens both in Tarab and in rumba.
Simbanguruma.
String rather than guitar. The mi solo. Do 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 do. Do do do.
Sisi tunakiri Simba wa Yuda. Yuko hai. Yuko hai. Tena kifo hakimuwezi. Hakimuwezi. Ameshinda kifo. Tena atawala. Milele na milele. Forever.
Yeah, then he starts repeating it, but in a different way. There's an unspoken understanding that the authority of the underworld over mankind is undone through the work of the Lion of Judah. Those in the world living in the in-between space thereafter are ushered into the kingdom of the Lion of Judah and have hope of everlasting life and living because of the work and the reign of the Lion of Judah. This is the message of the gospel, well demonstrated by using imagery of spiritual warfare that is biblical and contextually appropriate to Kenyan coastal beliefs. In an interview, Kigame told me that he wanted the contrasting Seben to be as exuberant as the text it carried. He also decided to move the action from the coast to the hinterland. So from out here, Tarab to the hinterland. And this is how he does it. In the Seben section, the Sukus reassembly was collated from the Luo people who live around Kisumu, a group that lives around Lake Victoria. When Congolese musicians were forced into exile due to war, some secular musicians played a circuit that included Kisumu, Nairobi, and Mombasa. Kisumu has a very vibrant club scene. These musicians influenced Luo musicians who already had generated a popular music called Benga, drawn on indigenous Luo oratory and wedding courtship styles. The resulting hybrid was a reappropriation by Congolese musicians into a soukous subgenre. Some Luo musicians also performed the club and tourist circuit. A fusion of Congolese soukous dance and Luo wedding dances morphed into a style and musical form known as kanungo that was a favorite on the circuit. This musical style is actually the backbone of Kigame's Seben. Simba wa Yuda is an apt illustration of anxieties about polycultural identity in post-colonial, multi-religious Africa. Kigame returns and retunes and resounds and reassembles various musical genres with different associations. Kigame's performance is also a return, a retuning, a resounding, and a reassembling of an old composition, reworking Luvembe's song in contemporary musical footage. Kigame candidly reflects on the decisions he made, consciously or unconsciously, in the music and its production. He told me many times how he went to boarding school, what affected him in boarding school. By the way, he's blind. So he went to boarding school when he was about 4 years old, and then continued until he got to college, and that's when he was reintegrated into the general public. But he was in a school for the blind for most of his time, for most of his life. So this brings into question the very many identities that include his ethnic heritage and language, schooling in different schools, encountering and learning other languages, other musicings, other religions, the impact of the radio in introducing him to worlds he would never see or imagine. And by the way, he also told me that when he does videos, he directs them himself. And I asked him how. You cannot see. All these things make for plural identities that are a fact of life in most of Africa. In analyzing and theorizing about the diversity of religions that traverse Africa, Dutch scholar De Witte describes the situation as cohabiting religions. De Witte and other scholars in the anthropology of religion theorize on the phenomenology of post-1970s Pentecostal charismatic Christianity in Africa. In my opinion, these anthropologists dissect the work of Pentecostalism as a faith and spiritual venture. They do not successfully explore the tapestry from which and into which Pentecostalism speaks in terms of the fluidity of African identity formation. More specifically, they do not explore the labor of Christianity in Africa. Therefore, I assess De Witte's observations as a realization that layers of religion undergird the lives of most Africans. Indigenous religions index ethnic affiliation. These systems ground a second layer of religion externally sourced or imposed, such as Christianity or Islam. Beyond these, Hinduism or Sikhism may also permeate the landscape because of the British practice of indenturing South Asians in their colonies. De Witte's cohabitation of religion only scratches the surface. I contend that Kigame's Simbanguruma better reflects the African reality, demonstrating not just a cohabitation, but the progeny of that cohabitation, and how that progeny is expressed through the arts, and more particularly through music. The brokers of this music, the composers, the performers, the producers, scholars, they present, they interpret, they interrogate, and they resolve the offspring of this progeny. I will even further posit that rites of community have created fertile ground for the cross-pollination of religions on the continent. James Ogude, a Kenyan literature scholar, provides a reading of the work of popular arts informed by the work of a British anthropologist called Karen Berber. She had an essay called Popular Arts in Africa. Berber asserts that popular arts are instigated, produced, and consumed in informal and unofficial spaces inhabited by the masses before they become so popular that they are taken up elsewhere. They often transcend borders and have great mobility in part because of the media through which they are transmitted. They are also extremely accessible, attracting a public rather than a community. In the urban milieus where these arts fermented in Africa, there was a public rather than a community. In essence, these arts created community. To create community, forms of engagement were necessary. Ogude assesses the work of popular arts as mediating the boundaries of class, gender, ethnicity that were destabilized by colonialism, external religions, and new socio-political frames. Johannes Fabian, who worked in the Congos, he's an anthropologist that theorized that popular arts were not just, and I quote, derivatory mixtures or superficial adaptations of imported Western elements. Rather, they were labors designed to interrogate and make sense of a world that had become wild for the Africans. The emergence of these popular arts in Christian circles created an ambivalent and conflicting relationship as works of ministry or works of commerce. However, they provided a space to work out identities that had previously been navigated via indigenous rites of passage and belonging in order to circumscribe social and political networks of belonging. New communities created with the adoption of Western Christianity and colonialism ushered in an era of complex social relationship beyond kinship, primarily through the church and the school. A third layer, that of nationality, was shrouded over the church and the school. In much of East and Central Africa, Arab or Arabized traders often preceded, led, or followed European explorers and missionaries. Therefore, Islam was often established in the same vicinity as Christianity. In that case, family and kin could belong to different external religions or to different countries, culled out of colonial governance and other factors. Thus, 4 identifiers were possible for those who joined church, school, or were located in a particular country. Dislocation impacted the way these cohabitations interacted. Children were sent to boarding schools with colleagues from different culture groups and religious affiliations. Travel and work in cities where different ethnic groups cohabited intensified the desire to assimilate. Political unrest, exile, and displacement exaggerated the coalescence of disparate nationalities bearing religious and other affiliations. Migration beyond the continent brought its own anxieties, so that emergent and ongoing scholarship on African identities still look to colonialism and foreign religions as what has most impacted African identity. Modern African countries and their citizens identify in polycultural terms and navigate polyreligious identities. Music is embedded in these cultures and religions. Both music and religion still index and express each other. In Kigame's case, the intersection of music with Christianity draw from a broad array of affiliations that may be engineered from social spaces that already index an assortment of values, beliefs, and expectations. This is typical in most cities around the world. The situation in Africa is particularly interesting because most nation states were formed based on European ideals undergirded by each imperial power's prevailing Christian religious orientation. These Christianities intersected with or cohabited with indigenous African systems alongside or competing with Islam that had either arrived earlier or arrived with, or else European colonialism opened the hinterland for both religions. Pentecostalism and charismaticism, as well as popular culture, have surprisingly provided a type of template for working out these anxieties. While these identities may be expressed in religious terms, but also according to religious affiliation, they are part of the labor of Christianity in Africa. An understanding of the labor of Christianity in Africa before, during, and post-colony is necessary. The work of religion in Europe or in the Western psyche may have been understood as servicing a spiritual dimension of life, hence the constant contrast with carnality or secularity. Christianity in Africa was about a total and radical denunciation of Africanness, even if it still defined people's geography, their physical attributes, and their histories. Beyond religion, the process of eradication was enacted from many fronts. Christianity introduced new social connections that both isolated and expanded relationships. Further, the colonial government, through Western schooling, introduced yet another set of expectations designed to transform not just how knowledge was processed, produced, consumed, and transmitted, but whose final outcome was to prepare students for new vocations such as pink, white, or blue-collar jobs. Socialization for the processes of identity creation and affirmation, together with expected outcomes, was transferred to school or church. Previous leisure activities that included creative and performing arts, as well as sports, were adjusted, or their message was changed to reflect the new way of life. The tensions that therefore accompanied coexisting modes of living were usually conveyed in the audio, visual, verbal, creative, and performing arts. Therefore, the oft-expressed frustration regarding the impact of new Pentecostalisms by anthropologists or theologians or scholars in religion and other disciplines with maybe a different lived experience and expectation of religion fails to take into account this labor of Christianity or Islam in Africa as imposed partly as a component of imperialist European colonialism or Middle Eastern jihadism. In my opinion, the arts provided a liminal space to express and work out these anxieties and adjudicate possible resolutions that, while also projecting a possible future. It is in this space that the issues of cohabiting and sometimes competing religions are performed and effected. Therefore, popular arts and their artists thrive because of the never-ending and fast turnout and turnaround of knowledge and the continuing displacement and relocation of African peoples occasioned by unstable governments, economic imperialism, environmental disasters, and many other factors. The arts in official, formal, and informal popular forms continue to articulate and process these tensions. Those who have discovered the power of the arts and its impact harness them for good and for not good. My analysis of one of Kigame's songs hopefully demonstrates the work of religious popular music in the labor of Christianity in Africa. This labor does not isolate the spiritual from the everyday. In fact, it infuses the everyday with God's Spirit. Neither does it necessarily dichotomize the secular from the sacred, although it takes exception to negate the profane. It also demonstrates the more or less holistic approach to Christian faith, where all the senses are invoked to worship the living God. Christianity has to do with turning, orienting, testifying, and building a community of faith that is the body of Christ. The various ways that Kigame and other music ministers speak for and to the Christian community globally are a metaphoric demonstration of the Christian call to turn and return, to align with and into the kingdom of God, tuning and being in tune, as well as a retuning to be in accord with both the living God and the church at large. It requires a sounding of praise, testifying about the person, mission, work, and vision of the living God through Christ to those who may not be aware, or to each other in order to assemble the nations in every land of every tribe and creed, to acknowledge and live in awe, obedience, honor to the living God through Christ Jesus. This is what makes for a different song than all other songs that service other than the worship of the living God.
Yeteshe